You are listening to MSP 1337. I'm your host, Chris Johnson, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today. First and foremost, I'd like to thank our sponsor, MSP-Ignite. MSP-Ignite offers a peer group experience that is unique to managed service providers in the technology industry. If you are serious about implementing a model for success through sharing and collaboration of best practices, this is the best way to do it. Head on over to msp-ignite.com to get more information. All right, on to the show. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of MSP 1337. I'm joined again this week by Joe. No, I'm not.
Smith.
Josue?
Yes.
Is it Josue from Denver?
It is indeed. Hello.
Joshua
Hello.
Smith
Thank
from
you. Yeah.
Varonis.
Yes.
I've been working on this pattern of introducing guests that where I know them well, I stumble over their names, and I'm starting to question whether or not I'm beginning the stages of dementia myself. So I apologize to all of you listening. This is Joshua Smith of Varonis.
Thank you, Christine.
Yes, thank you. I recently did update my driver's license. I appreciate you calling me out.
Yes. So what are we talking about, Chris? What are we talking about?
This episode, season 2, episode 1, we are talking about an ounce of prevention, a pound
of cure.
A cure.
Yes.
Got it. So is that 2 in the hand or better than 1? I'll stop the metaphors. Last week we talked about pre and post boom, or if you want to make this sort of seem less impactful, pre and post incident. So this week, I thought it would be a good idea to take something from last week's episode, which really talked about a lot of the protect components. I mean, it was a buffet smorgasbord of protect tools. And then we jumped into something has gotten through the defenses, and we were really short on our list of respond. And so you and I were talking before we started the episode. I will take any day of the week an ounce of prevention to a pound of cure. And I think that's really important because there are a lot of tools out there that fall into that protect space, and a well-executed security services plan, I think, reduces, even if it doesn't fully prevent, it reduces the probability of them getting through without a lot more effort. And there's always someone down the street that's done a poor job of batting down the hatches, right? So I think it's important for us to talk about what does protecting the environment mean, because we know it goes beyond products and service subscriptions, but it's also important to note that when we think about managed services, that we separate IT operations from InfoSec. I think that if we don't do that, then the client just assumes it's all lumped together in one huge, messy soup. So I think you've got some interesting ideas on this, and I'll just lob the ball your direction and see if I have to call out squirrel.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So hit me.
So if you were to just pick the protect category in your NIST domains, where would you start from a protect standpoint? What's the first product or service you feel is important to plug into the environment?
Oof, that's like asking me to pick my favorite kid or kitten, I guess. I do think it goes back to, and you're right, like obviously AV's, here to stay, it's critical. But that whole prevention is to try to minimize the number of at bats the bad guys get to try to take a whack at your AV pinata, right? So I think, going back to the 3 Ps, process, people, product. I think process is big, and I think education is big. So I think, it's crazy to me that the best way, I think, to secure an organization in cybersecurity in this day and age with bits and bytes is with pen and paper. I think, focusing on what's the best.
Go back to pen and paper.
Go back to pen and paper. Tabletop exercises.
Everybody listening? We're going back to pen and paper. We will stop these guys in their tracks.
Get your quill, get your little pot of inkwell and your parchment. Yeah, right. Let's go.
We're gonna have to get new desks. We're gonna have to get new desks to hold those inkwells. Yeah.
in the little draft table.
Okay,
But
squirrel.
yeah. No, I think what we're talking about, announcer prevention, really is making sure that you understand, how all of your products, how all your processes, and how all your people work together. And sometimes those people, like you said, for an organization is going to be an MSP. Who do they represent? Do they represent, your CIO, your CTO, your CISO, all of the above? It's not really on it's MSP's responsibility to essentially know what the customer needs in their entire ecosystem.
Yep.
Right. The customer knows they need HR, they need finance, they need sales, they need, all the marketing, they need all these things. They need technology to run all this, but they also need security to make sure that they're the only ones, reading their emails. Right. So I think a very top down, or maybe even bottom up, your call, analysis of how all these different elements fit together, because you can't really know what to plug in, vis-a-vis a product, right? Until you know what gap you're plugging into.
So do you think, as we use the 3Ps, do you think that as we look at the people, process, product, if I were to rewind just a little bit, I think about when you and I ran an MSP, we were heavily focused on automation, right? Because the two of us could not be in 5 places at once, patching workstations, and then fighting, 3:00 in the afternoon traffic to go home, and then go back the next day because it didn't finish patching.
Yeah.
Right? Like, those were not considered security services. We didn't even consider them ourselves as security. In fact, I would argue that when we thought about firewalls and firewall management, our focus wasn't how did we secure their environment? It's how did we check the box to say, as a managed service provider, you can't have a client that doesn't have a firewall. I mean, that was, and I'm not saying that to place judgment on us. I think we were following kind of this recipe to become successful MSPs. And along the way, we started realizing that the more we put into the security side of things, the easier it kind of got in some respects, because we had a clearer path. And so that's kind of where I was going with this, thought is, I feel like it's about the destination in some respects of the path that we're on. So if I were to ask the question, what does my IT operations look like? Well, what's the outcome expectation? Lights are on. I can print. My Windows update is now Windows 11, and it's supposed to be that way. And I'm happy with, like, we were tied to a operational productivity efficiency, not a how tightly did I turn the wrenches to prevent you from using bad passwords or poor passwords, right? So we have that in sort of, I don't want to say in rear view, but that's the piece that has to get sort of extrapolated before we can start clearly defining or creating the path forward that says, and now these are the security products and services. These are the people that I'm involving, whether they're third-party partners or in-house, to be successful with that protect model. Because I don't think that's how we operated when we said managed services. And I say that to more of because it's in the past, not that as an MSP today, you weren't saying I have an obligation to protect.
Yeah.
But we have to somewhat separate the two out a little bit so that we're clear in our explanation to our clients and clear in our explanation to our staff, so that the expectations are realistic.
I think when as you're talking about that, I had like the vision of the cloud responsibility model, through IaaS, PaaS, all that kind of stuff. There's that kind of like diagonal line that goes through, where the customer is responsible and where the cloud operator, the slash, the cloud service provider is responsible. And in my mind jumped in a large image of CIA, right? And so then I thought, kind of the same thing. There's a diagonal slash where I think the IS, the security department, is kind of responsible for the C, and let's say half the I. And I think the IT department is kind of responsible for a little, also half of an I, but also the A. So I feel like IT is responsible more for the availability, and I feel like security is really responsible for the confidentiality. And they both kind of have to work together for that,
for the integrity.
Yeah.
I would agree with that. I think that that's one of the areas where, especially in today's day and age, when we go back to when when you and I were, I guess you could say, hanging up shop with managed services, cloud was becoming the transformational managed services, right? So like, hey, look, we're going to move it to the Azure stack, and therefore all of these problems go away. No, I mean, the problems that we were dealing with, yes, in fact, did go away, but it introduced, a completely different set of problems, right?
Yeah, it turned into a different problem.
And I think that the beauty of what cloud services bring is the infrastructure components that you and I can't spend enough money on to guarantee, the disasters that we haven't planned for, right? The lightning hit the light pole outside of my house, which in turn fried everything in my house electronics, but then it hit the transformer in the power pole next to that then took out the entire square block. I mean, you can't plan that event, right? Like there's no, if you did the same experiment 3 times with electricity, it would have 3 different outcomes. How many outcomes can you plan for on that on-prem infrastructure model when those things actually just to some extent are gone? But now we're going to that, what was entirely our focus of keep your lights on, keep the business running, be able to quickly get you back online in the event of something failing, is now, how do I secure it? How do I lock it down? How do I ensure that it's got certain security components in play that our clients are assuming things like, well, it's Microsoft. What do you mean I got to add a firewall? What do you mean I got to add this third party vendor's backup solution or whatever it might be? So to some extent, the cloud product service infrastructure has paved the way for an MSP to transition to a focus that includes more security products and services on the protect side, because of, I no longer have to focus my energy on the infrastructure lights on power side.
Yeah, I think the availability has elevated more to DR, right? Because you don't have to spend time figuring out how to wire stuff and UPS and all that kind of stuff. You really just got to focus on how can I, spread this data over maybe multiple availability zones. How can I leverage?
When was that a conversation? Like, so are we redundant in multiple regions?
No, you're not. Traditionally, right? But then also, we get a lot into, templating is a huge thing, right? So back in the day, we'd know how we'd want to set our firewall up and we have this like little checklist. But now, with I guess you can call it DevOps or whatever you want, things like Ansible and playbooks where you can essentially deploy through, Terraform or whatever product you're using into AWS or Azure. You can kind of roll out your basic stack. Right. And you can have a lot of that stuff. It's a lot of upfront work, right? Ounce of prevention.
But your templates are, once created, no longer have the repeat workload that we had when we did this in on-prem environments where each firewall we were unboxing and plugging power into it.
Yeah. And the scalability is a whole other thing, but you now have to become a lot more aware of how do all these things interconnect, because you can no longer say, here's my switch. Okay, I'm plugging into the firewall on this port. I'm plugging into the server on this port. And now I know that the only way these bits are going to flow is right through here. Right now it's more conceptual. Right? Like you have to understand all the different ways that
abstract security architecture.
It's all the Azure's connecting all these things, how AWS is connecting all these things, and how they're being exposed. Right, because traditionally the perimeter was the firewall, and now the perimeter is identity, because anyone can log in from anywhere and anyone can attempt to bang on tenants as much as they want.
The perimeter keeps changing. Right, I think about like a moat around a castle, and now instead of it being a moat, it's more like a river, and every time the seasons change, the river flows in different directions, so you end up with either the water's really close to the castle or it could be really far away, but it's always changing, right? So it's almost like playing what is it, Axis and Allies, where I've captured this continent and then tomorrow somebody else captured that and I no longer have that. I've moved, my borders have changed yet again. I don't want to go too far off base because I think we went from products and services to cloud infrastructure, right? But I think it's yes and no. Maybe I'll say it's a chipmunk, so smaller squirrel, right?
Small squirrel.
What I'm envisioning here is we've created a line that wasn't necessarily around products and services. We've created a line around helping MSPs that we know lots of MSPs have moved cloud architecture, cloud infrastructure from what was previously on prem, but
Mhm.
how do we help them identify now the security products and services that help them be successful? Because it's no longer really about the user creation in 365. I mean, that's not complicated, and you can create an admin user that doesn't have a lot of security privileges that can create new users at the same level of permission. But when you get into, am I monitoring things like DLP and how CUI data might move in and out, what's being tagged, did my control mappings change, do I need to, like, I feel like that's where, and I feel like that's also where the explanation to the client becomes complicated, because if they truly understood the new role that MSPs are kind of playing today, not kind of, are playing today as a security advisor, whether they want it or not, being able to provide that guidance with evidence, that path to evidence that says, here's how you're meeting those requirements, here's how we're meeting those requirements.
Yeah. I kind of feel like a broken record, but I think just constantly going back and understanding, rather with kind of coming from like a tool first approach, you kind of come from what we're trying to protect approach, going back to that
Data
pen and
first.
paper, data first. Hey, that's definitely Varonis saying for sure is, we focus on the data because that's where the bad guys are going, right? That's where the crown jewels is the data. So I think understanding and having a heart to talk with your customer, like thinking back now, I honestly, in doing what I do now, and like what I do now mostly is reoccurring conversations with my customers, right? I've got like bi-weekly calls with my customers. We just call work hours, office hours or whatever. Sure. And we just talk about like, hey, what's going on in your environment? What kind of initiatives you're going for? What's going to come out, and what are you working on the next year, the next 6 months, right? And we have our QBRs and all those kind of things. I wish that I had more candid conversations with our customers, because a lot of times you don't know what you don't know, right? You go in there and you kind of have an agenda in mind, like, okay, we're going to talk only about their emails, like they need to lock down their emails, right? Whereas they might have had some sort of other information dangling off of their network that we never really found out about, because we never really said, like, let's talk about your business,
right?
Because at the end of the day, we're moving all this data around not for giggles, right? We're moving all this data around for a reason, for some sort of service, for a business. So if we can better understand what the customer is trying to achieve, what are their business goals, and what are those issues that are stopping them from achieving their goals. We want to talk at their level, and then we, as IT technology business experts, right, we're the ones that translate it. And I feel like a lot of times I maybe expected the customer to speak my language more so than me trying to speak my customer's language. So I think the sooner we can understand, tell me everything. Like, don't come to me with IT in mind, come to me with your business in mind, and let's find out
what's important to you.
What's important to you? Like, what's your mission critical stuff, that kind of stuff. But try not to get bogged down in like talking about mail servers, right? Talk about more like, start with, how do you communicate with your customers, right? What are some vital business processes that you have that if you couldn't do it, your business would grind to a halt? And that could be anything from a donut machine, if it's a donut shop, to some sort of quoting.
You can't sell donuts.
Or to some sort of quoting machine for a financial services company, right? Everyone's going to have their own different thing. So I think taking off our, IT hat and just trying to, understand each individual environment. You can throw the same tools at the same different environments. I get that, but understanding how to prioritize risk, right, and focus on that kind of the lowest hanging fruit that can essentially provide the biggest bang for the buck when we do decide to move forward and offer them some sort of service. Because you can't always come in, because a lot of companies don't have things budgeted. I run into that all the time, because everyone has their AV budgeted, everyone has their firewall, everyone has all these, like, all the core things budgeted. But when we start talking about, how do you know where your sensitive data is and who has access to it, and then say, we can help you solve that, they're like, that's amazing. We didn't even know that. We didn't even know to budget for it, right? So let's talk next year,
So I think
helping them understand that and helping yourself understand that, I think, is kind of the first place to start.
So the key here is this is a predominant mindset of MSPs, but it's not limited to MSPs. I think everybody in the IT services space, whether you're an internal employee or not, is how do I dial in tool X, right? How do I deliver products and services that are addressing some of those security things? What I think is interesting is what you're proposing, and what obviously I actually I agree with you. Is you're welcome. I agree with you today. So well, it makes me think about, where's your data? What's important to you? Those are not check boxes, right? That's not oh, well, based on the fact that you make donuts, I need to put a firewall in.
Right.
They're the clients can be like, for what? Like, we're not even using a proprietary recipe. Yeah. We're in an isolated part of the Amazon rainforest where we don't even have running water. These donuts are amazing. Yes. So along those lines, I feel like walking backwards a little bit gets into this mindset that, to your point on budgeting, it's easy to budget for firewalls, right? It's got a predictable, this is what I spend every year or 3 years. It's renewable subscription services, new hardware, et cetera. Mm-hmm. When you talk about risk and data and what's important to my business, well, that's not as predictable, and it changes far more frequently in most business environments than the firewall. So if we know what's important and what's critical, and where it lives is factored into how we're delivering, securing that information, then our approach to products and services is going to be different too. How do you put that into words now so that the client understands, well, we're going to do 2 firewalls instead of 1 because your donuts are so amazing. We got to protect the whole.
Krispy Kreme, they'll break right in, steal your stuff.
That's right. It'll be a new donut on the bottom of the menu.
Yeah, I mean, I think a very straightforward business assessment, right? Essentially help them, because it's surprising sometimes how much people don't know about their own environment. Even like medium-sized, smaller medium enterprises. Right. It's a lot. There's a lot of siloed information, because when I go to talk to somebody in the IS and ask them things about details about their circuits, because we got to talk about, data pipeline, that kind of stuff, like how much room they have to send data around, they have no clue. And they've got like, oh, well, I'm going to have to reach out to, infrastructure team or whatever that as well. And obviously that doesn't play as much in SMB space, but it can be that there just isn't a person that knows that kind of stuff. So again, before we can start to, I think, offer a one-size-fits-all solution, or attempt to really, we need to make sure that they understand what they're protecting as well. Because again, don't know what you don't know. If we ask them questions, we can't always assume that they know the answers. Even if they give us an answer, it's kind of like trust but verify, right? Because especially when you're dealing with smaller businesses, they essentially installed whatever they were told to install. Right. They went into a new building. The Verizon guy walked up and said, oh, you guys, you need this. Right. And they've never thought to look at, do they really need that? Or do they need something else? Box.
It's back to checking box. So I was recently asked to put together a strategy around, not a strategy, basically security, like a CISO, security officer position. Mm-hmm. I got asked, well, what's your methodology? I was like, well, yesterday you had a job description, and now you're asking me for a methodology. So I was trying to how to qualify the role of CISO or security officer in the context of what MSPs are dealing with when we start to have the security conversation. And I think it's still as important to have this conversation without adding the security element, because I think they go hand in hand. Business risk is still business risk, regardless. If you can't print, that's a business risk, even if it wasn't tied to some sort of security vulnerability. Sure. But if we were to describe first 90 days of onboarding this client, what are you doing? I can think of 3 things out of the gate. The first one is understanding the business risk. Mm-hmm. The second one would be who's on my team to support the strategy around protecting that data, to reducing or minimizing the risk where necessary. And then, what does it look like as we move forward to continue to measure and report on that protection of data? And I think you could come up with, a list of 10 things, or every week you've got something different that you're doing. But the bottom line is, and I think to your point, I have to understand your business, how it operates, what the security strategy has been, if it even existed. How do you interact with the market that you're in? And do you have buy-in from your stakeholders for the changes that might need to be made, which is putting us in the position of having this conversation in the first place?
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll also kind of wedge in there again, coming from the vendor I work with right now. Our big thing is data privacy, data protection.
Yeah.
You said, who's on my team to help protect our data?
Yeah.
And I would say, and then you got to go a little bit further. What data?
Right. And
because
and
also
the categorization of that data, right?
Classification for sure, because you're not going to spend $10,000 to protect your chicken soup recipe, but you might want to do it if it's like the entire HR directory of your organization, your database that has everyone's social security numbers and their pay scales and all these things that would be quite embarrassing and possibly litigious if it were to get out.
Let's use the example right there. We have what just happened with T-Mobile. The majority of those accounts that were compromised, that PII data that was compromised, they weren't even T-Mobile customers. So it raises the question, like when someone went and sat down with T-Mobile to say, hey, what data is important to you? Because I would think the data that's most important is your actual client data, and the data that's not important to you, you shouldn't be keeping. Like it shouldn't be data that you have. Or were you saying that our customers aren't that important, but all these guys that want to be T-Mobile customers, their data is really important. We've collected all of it.
Right. And obviously this is just satire. No disrespect to T-Mobile. We love you and your lawyers.
All of them.
And that was a great point that you mentioned there about you're asking what is their important data.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that should be the follow-up question to tell me about all your data. Then we can focus on the important data, because again, like you said, sometimes there's sensitive data that they don't think is important to them. I work with customers that have, we classify all the data and we find social security numbers, PCI, PHI all over the place. And we also can kind of quantify how stale it is. And, we go into some places where we do our risk assessment and we see sensitive data open to everyone in the organization that hasn't been touched in 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, 10 years. Right. And so they probably think, oh, that's not really important. Like, well, it is to that person whose data it is, right? Or to the compliance officer that's going to have to explain that if and when they try to go through a PCI assessment or something along those lines, or dare answer a cybersecurity insurance questionnaire.
I can tell you that that's also not necessarily 100% accurate on stale data, because I might have recently come across an archive from Untangled Solutions from 2013.
Wow. Yeah.
That was an entire set of templates built around security service offerings. I went through about a third of them and I'm like, where have you been all my life since 2013? I have lost 8 years of my life trying to build something that I didn't know I already had.
There you go.
I will say though, that was a very much an exception to the rule, but I think that it's easy to become data hoarders because we're not in the days of Polaroids and film, right? You don't use your iPhone to take 4 pictures on vacation. You take 400 pictures and you look at 4 of them. Right. Yeah. You're like, did we get the picture? Yeah, we got the picture. It's a 15 megapixel camera. I mean, shoot, I was bent out of shape. I was bent out of shape when I wasted one of my 12 Polaroid pictures, none of which were going to turn out well because I had no idea what I was doing with the camera in the first place. Now I have an iPhone that costs $1,000. I take pictures that no one cares about, no one wants, and I'm calling myself a photographer.
Yeah.
Because I put it all over Facebook, Instagram, like everybody looks and comments on it. I got 8 thumbs up. I bet they were thumb up because of the quality of the picture. Has to be.
But also, we talked about classification too. So, even though you did find that old zip file, if we were to, the systems can open up zips and look through all that data and realize that there's probably nothing sensitive in there. There's something helpful, right? It was actually helpful to you, right? But we want to first understand where all the data is, and then start to prioritize the risk of that data and how much we want to protect it. So it goes back to just to planning, like time and time again. I'm just gonna keep ringing the same bell of that prevention, and that prevention involves, planning, process, procedure, all the things that let you understand the field that you're supposed to be playing in for this organization, because you can't protect what you don't know about, and you can't prioritize, unless you're given the entire menu of data that whatever organization you're going into is essentially storing, whether it's on-prem in the cloud. I mean, talk about blowing the can off here. SaaS.
That's a big boom.
That's a big boom. I mean, think about all the sensitive data that's in Salesforce or in Box. Or
I'm going to go with all of it is in
Yeah.
Salesforce, because it's all attached to users in Salesforce, which means at least the user has sensitive data to somebody.
Yeah. And have you ever looked into like administrating like the user permissions in Salesforce?
I have done a few audits on Salesforce, and I will tell you that I can understand when MSPs are quick to say, we only manage the user integrity for the following 4 applications.
Yeah. Yeah.
So real quick before we close this out completely.
Yes.
I made this note. I actually wrote it down
on paper.
On paper.
Oh, look at that.
Actually, it's erasable paper.
Oh,
so it's like it's like a whiteboard in a notebook.
Nice.
That pages turn and everything, and then you can wipe them off and start all over again. It's great stuff.
Technology.
Yeah, right. Pen and paper. I was thinking about what you said about the data classification, where's my data, those kind of things. So I'm just going to step through this. I wrote it down as quickly as it came into my head before it disappeared. We know I'm dealing with dementia.
Yes.
And no joke, I was joking, but I do not wish that on anybody. So here's what I came away with: protecting what, where, why, and for how long. Because I think when we go back to protect and thinking about the tools and services we're using to protect ourselves and our client, it's not the same tool necessarily for all data. And we don't necessarily want to assume that we use the same tool for all the data, because there's costs that come with that may be part of that budget challenge, because we're saying, big paintbrush, I'm going to protect everything, even though not everything really needed to be protected. And then when that gets in that, information category, what are the risks and how impactful would it be if it was compromised? If you got the floor plans to our office building, I really don't care. It's not even my office building. But if you have the recipe to the Red Lobster biscuits, that's a different.
That's gold.
That's gold, right? Like,
yeah,
and it's a completely different, like, people talk about, the pen and paper and locking it in the safe somewhere. Okay, well, now maybe that information is in a category of extreme importance and how it's being protected. Well, who knows about the safe that it's sitting in? Who knows about, right? Like, are you putting the time in to knowing where and what is in that location to use the appropriate tools that go with it? And then the last one goes back to what you had just said was, is the data stale? Because if the data is stale, that can still be just as risky to your organization. And all you really needed to do was get rid of it.
Yeah.
So
it's still as sensitive. It's still as sensitive, right? But people are probably paying less attention to it. And I think that's where the danger is on stale sensitive data, is that it's kind of out of sight, out of mind.
Microsoft calls it out all the time. If you're following Microsoft best practices when you stand up an AD environment, you should not be leaving OUs empty, right? Yeah. Like, that's a stale OU, right? Immediately stale. So all of a sudden there's users in there. How do you know there's users in there? You haven't been in there since the beginning. Why would you go in there? You didn't put anything in there.
Yeah.
And now it's full.
Same with users. I mean, one of the metrics, we go through in our data reviews is, how many stale enabled users that haven't logged in 60 or 90 days or made any events in your environment in the last 60 or 90 days. And because a lot of times people will be like, okay, or even how many disabled users do you have? I mean, I've come across ones with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of disabled users because their policy is to never delete a user. Right. I'm like, well, yeah, but what if someone comes in and says, oh, that person has the same title as this person, but the person that was disabled had been there for 20 years and had collected all these different permissions, right? Permission creep. And now you just essentially didn't solve a problem. You created a problem by just cloning the old user and
Right.
not creating from fresh, right? So
Right, like,
I'm sure we've
oh,
seen that tons of times,
they
right?
work out of this office. I'm just gonna pick Betty or John to create a user in that same group, and it's like,
Yeah.
oh, they used to be the CEO, and they happened to the org chart structure changed, whatever, right?
Yeah. Or you accidentally enable the wrong user. It's a super old user, didn't have password policy, and now you're going to get hit with some cred stuff in their password sprays.
I mean,
right?
you and I have not so common names, obviously, but
Right.
if we were to be in an organization where someone might have the same name as
Sure.
us,
Yes.
God forbid, what does
Yeah.
that look like? I will tell you, in the organization I am at today, there is somebody that has the exact same name as me, spelled exactly the same way. He works in custodial services. I do not. You could see how there's the potential for someone responsible for AD user creation or permission changes could inadvertently give the wrong person the keys to the kingdom.
Yeah. So
Fortunately, I was here first.
I was going to say, okay, so who's C. Johnson 2?
Yeah. So I do not have the 2 after the end of my name. So, Josh,
Yes.
any last things to share with the audience who is now going, wow, I heard the word squirrel multiple times.
Yep.
We've reduced it to a chipmunk, and
Yes.
it's all about the data being consumed by chipmunks and squirrels.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of keep it simple, silly, or whatever second S you want to use there.
Silly.
Because technology, automation, these are all just ways to do things more efficient, but they're still basic things that we're doing just at a higher level with computers, right? So if we can, that's why the tabletop exercise is so great, because we kind of get the computers out of the way and we talk through the different, policies,
pen and
procedures. Pen and paper. Yeah, I'm going to go back to it, right? I think understanding the environments you're going into, documenting these things, and trust but verify. Find out where the organization's data is. Find out where all their data is, because
Right.
it's not just going to be on their file server.
And
right?
change your voice when you say it.
Change your voice and see
all of your data.
Right? You're going to have personal devices, right? Coming in there, BYOD. You're going to have old servers that end up in someone's closet, right? Somewhere,
Plugged
right? You're going to have plugged in. You're going to start having hybrid networks with your, Exchange Online mixed with your Exchange on-prem, mixed with, you got a little S3 bucket over here. You got Salesforce over here.
Yeah.
So fully understanding the environment you're walking into, making sure that, that you ask 3 times, right?
Sure.
Ask 3 times where that data is, understanding, and then start to prioritize that data, start to get your arms wrapped around that data. And then you can start to prescribe cures for the risk surrounding that data.
So I'm just going to summarize here. I feel like what you said in a nutshell is be wary of the easy button that makes you believe it replaces people.
Yes. And like Dr. Gregory House would always say, people lie. So
right.
Just make sure that they know where their data is.
And even people telling the truth may still be lying because it's their truth.
Yeah.
Right? The truth.
Man. This is getting deep. I don't know.
Everybody out there listening, this has been an episode.
Stuff,
this has been an episode of MSP 1337. Thanks and have a great week.